Thanks for watching this video. My name is Mike Stolberger. I'm Director of Elections for Blue Earth County, and I'm going to walk through the equipment that we use in the polling place on Election Day. This video is designed as a refresher for our election judges so that you can review the equipment that you'll be setting up and interacting with while you're working in the polling place, assisting our voters cast their votes on Election Day. We're going to focus on the three pieces of equipment in the polling place. We'll talk about how to set it up, how to put it away after the last voter has cast his or her vote, and we'll just also give you some troubleshooting and some best practices, tips, and tricks as we work through the presentation. This video is also designed to be a part of an election judge workshop, so many of our judges will have completed that as well once they've attended this class in person. All of our election judges in Blue Earth County are required to go through our election judge training program. This video, setup video, is one part of that training program. We also have additional videos on our website just introducing you to the equipment and some of the background about the equipment. And we also have our rules and processes class online in case somebody wants to review that as well. We'd like to provide our election judges with some reminders before they actually work on Election Day. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at the actual slides. The slides are attached to all of our election judge training materials on our website. That's available at www.becvotes.org, and you can get all of this detail there if you want to review those slides on screen or print them out. Similarly, we give you some tips and tricks on setting up the polling place and getting ready for Election Day. But let's dive into the main focus for our video today. This video again is about the Election Day equipment, and one of the most important pieces of equipment in the polling place on Election Day is our tabulator. The tabulator is officially known as the DS200, and it is manufactured by Election Systems and Software, a company based out of Omaha, Nebraska. The machine essentially counts the votes as cast by the voters on their paper ballot. When the oval is filled in, the DS200's job is to read and record that vote so that we can provide results very quickly on election night. The DS200 is used in all of our precincts on Election Day, and those precinct level tabulators are specific to that precinct, meaning that only ballots issued in that polling place for that precinct can be cast and counted in the machines. The tabulator gets a 6-foot buffer around it, which makes sure that the voter is able to cast their ballot in private. And it also allows our judges to maintain a security bubble around there to make sure that folks aren't lingering around any of our equipment, including that DS200. The DS200 was first used in Blue Earth County in 2018 on a test basis, and then it was rolled out across the county in 2020. So this is our second election cycle for the equipment. And it has some really nice features that our election judges and our voters like. First and foremost, it has a color display. We'll talk about that when we open up the DS200. That allows a voter to see whether or not their ballot's been accepted, or if there's issues with their ballots, how they can remedy that. It also has an image capture for our write-ins, which allows us to audit that and count for any write-in contests if we would need to do that in a more effective manner. And then you'll also see how easy it is to set up and then shut down the equipment after the Election Day activities have occurred. What hasn't changed on the equipment is that it always has a backup, meaning it has an emergency or an auxiliary slot for ballots to be fed in case the machine would stop working for some reason. And then it also has an audit trail. That allows us to recreate activities, any inputs into the equipment, and then it also allows us to know when it's been opened and shut for Election Day activities. The tabulator also continues to have a battery backup in case we would lose power. And then it also ensures that the count that has been run through the machine is tracked throughout the day with a public count that's displayed on the screen whenever the polls are open on the DS200. Last but certainly not least, the DS200 does not connect to the internet. The only connection to the wall is for power. There is no modem, there is no transmitting of data through the DS200 on Election Day or even prior to Election Day. All updates are done through secure media in our elections office by trained staff, and we have an audit log recording any of those activities as well. So now let's dive into the setup of the equipment a little bit more. In Mankato, the DS200 will be in the polling places, securely locked in a storage compartment, and then there's also tamper evidence seals on the most important parts of the equipment. So when you arrive in the polling place, you're going to want to see if you're assigned to set up the DS200. We need to have 2 judges of different major political parties involved in the setup of the equipment, and the head judge, the person responsible for the polling place, is going to make that assignment. So that may or may not be your task. We're going to make sure that you do 3 things if you're setting up the DS200. First and foremost, we want to make sure that you follow the instructions. The instructions live on little cards that are attached to the back of the device. There's an open card, which is bright yellow, and there is a closed card, which is a bright green color. We want to make sure we follow all of the instructions on those cards as we're setting up or taking down the DS200. The best way to use those cards is to have one person do the reading and have the other judge do the doing. They would be the ones who are going to be implementing the instructions. That way you don't lose your spot. The second most important thing to remember about the DS200 is to always, always, always plug it in before you start working with any of the opening polls procedures. It's on the instructions, but we want to make sure that you get that plugged in. We plug it in so that we can make sure that all of the opening protocols happen the way that they're designed and programmed to happen. Once we have that set, we want to make sure that we have this device ready to go at 7 in the morning. And so we're going to follow the steps on the card, or we'll use these cheat sheet instructions that we have in the PowerPoint slide, again, that you can print out and have your own copy of if you'd like. The first thing we do is we make sure that there's no obvious damage or tampering with the DS200. That means that nothing appears to be broken or left open. All the security tapes are in place when we talked about that part of the setup. We make sure it's plugged in, as I mentioned, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do the one setup piece that our election judges often forget to do, and that is actually to set the bar to allow the tabulator to accept ballots. When you receive the equipment, you'll see that the bar is in the upward position on the back. It's a metal bar, and what we want to do is pull that up and then drop that down into that white cylinder, that white holder there, which opens up the tabulator so that it can accept ballots. All that does is physically open it. We're going to electronically and digitally open it with some setup that occurs inside the tabulator box. If you don't remember to do this, ballots are going to jam and you're going to have lots of issues on election day, so always be sure to do that early in your setup process. Okay? Don't ever engage the white locking mechanism. That will become quite challenging to take off at end of night and will frustrate you. But once you have that bar in place, we can turn the equipment back around and start to get ourselves ready to help voters. Our next step is to make sure that we have no ballots in the bin. Of course, there should be no ballots because we've had no voters, but we're going to check the auxiliary slot, make sure that's good, and we're going to check our main ballot box, which is also good and empty in our instance here. Once we know that's good and all set, we can actually open up the tabulator and begin working with it. Again, we use the key that is provided to your head judge to unlock the device. Once we have that unlocked, we can then use the other key that's provided by your head judge to actually get the equipment open, the tabulator open. And in a normal environment, this is then going to actually pop up and start the election for you. Because we're in demonstration mode and we don't actually want to have a full election loaded, you're not going to get the full experience in here. But as long as you're pulled up, the tabulator will actually start itself up and be ready for you to go through the final opening of the polls, procedures and steps to administer. What you'll also see when you're looking at this device is that you'll have a security seal across the compartment that has the memory stick, what records our election results. That stays intact and is only opened at end of night. Your head judge will be involved in that. And then similarly, it is going to print out that audit report to make sure that everything is still programmed as it was. It'll tell you what precinct you're in, and it'll make sure that nothing has changed or manipulated the way that the machine is going to tabulate. As I said, we're going to let that load up. Normally it would pop directly up to your election, but because we are in demonstration mode, it is just going to pull up with a screen that's going to ask for some additional details. Once the screen is fully loaded, it will tell you that there are 0 votes in the public count on the piece of equipment. Again, the most important thing to do is to follow the instruction sheet. As long as we follow the instruction sheet, you'll be able to have a successful open of the polls, and you'll be ready to roll at 7 in the morning. When we talk about tearing down the DS200 and actually shutting it down for the evening, the first thing that we do is we make sure that all voters are done casting their ballots. We leave this machine fully functional until at least 8 p.m. We wait until that last voter in line at 8 p.m. casts their ballot into the machine before we begin shutting it down. The first thing that we do as we look to shut down the piece of equipment is that we make sure that there are no ballots that were put inside of the auxiliary slot for some reason, and that all of our ballots have been cast and are in here. We leave the ballots down there until we're a little bit farther along, but we make sure that we have all of our ballots accounted for before we begin shutting down the machine. Again, when we go through the shutdown process, we're going to follow our green card. Our green card is going to tell you how to shut down the polls. It's very easy to shut down the polls. The first thing that we do is we open up our security slot. We keep the tamper evidence seal showing that we broke it and that we broke it because we're counting the results or closing the polls. And then we're going to push a button in there that tells us to close the polls. Sometimes our judges forget to actually hold that button down. You need to hold that down until the light actually goes out so the polls will close. A report will run, several reports will run actually, and your head judge will know what to do with those. Once those reports are run, we can then start packing up the equipment and putting it away. The first thing that we do in that regard is raise this bar back up to put that in the locked position so that no additional ballots can be fed. Then we follow the instructions to wrap up the cord, close the instructions, and lock everything out. Again, if you have a partner, which you have to have for this device, and you are following those instructions, it's very easy to close the polls when the election day is done. If we can just make one final point or one final reminder in terms of what to do with this device, make sure your head judge is involved in it. I went through that very quickly. You pull out the thumb drive. There's things that your head judge is going to be involved in. So we want to make sure they're nearby. We just wanted to give you a quick preview in terms of how that equipment is shut down. Again, make sure it stays open until all votes have been cast and your head judge tells you to start closing down that equipment. Some troubleshooting, some questions that we oftentimes get with the DS200. If your DS200 is not accepting a ballot, it's almost certainly going to be due to the fact that that bar was not moved. Remember that that bar has to be in the down position when we're voting, and then it goes in the up position when we're closed. So you'd want to check to make sure that that bar was engaged correctly and fully if you're having any issues with ballots being received. If you're trying to keep the piece of the tabulator clean from scrap pieces of paper or other debris on the screen, we're going to use alcohol wipes that are provided. We want to be very careful that we're not putting anything into the tabulator that should not be in there, meaning nothing other than ballots. If you want to make sure that you're plugged in, you'll know that during the election day because the screen that's available for the voter to look at will have an animated ballot sliding across it. The machine is also going to beep at you if it's not plugged in. So those are some good keys to know whether or not the device is plugged in. And then we do get this question every election, so we want to help you prevent that from occurring. If you're opening the tabulator and you flip up the screen and nothing happens, that means you're not plugged in. We want to make sure that you're always plugged into the wall, or better yet, to a surge protector before you start opening the polls on the device. Remember, we always get it plugged in before we get too far along in our setup process. All right, so that is our DS200. As I mentioned, I went through those instructions very quickly. We're going to use our cheat sheet cards to get us through the process, but we're not going to start that until the head judge tells us to do so that we know that we're ready to open the polls and that we're also ready to close the polls when that time comes. So you might get assigned to that task, but make sure that you're given instructions by your head judge before you do anything. All right, so let's move on to a different device now. The next device we'll talk about is our OmniBallot. Our OmniBallot is our assisted voting device, and these pieces of equipment come from a company called Democracy Live, and they are gaining some widespread use in Minnesota. Many counties now use the OmniBallot as their assisted voting device. Duluth County's used them since 2020, and we've found that they work really well in providing independence and freedom of choice for our voters so that they can vote in whichever method works best for them. What happens with the OmniBallot is it essentially takes a paper ballot that every voter gets and mechanically fills in the ovals for that voter based on the prompts that they give it on the screen. Every single one of our precincts have an OmniBallot, and the OmniBallot reads a code on the ballot to make sure that it loads it up right and asks the voter the correct questions. One thing that our election judges need to remember is that as they're setting up the OmniBallot, we want to make sure that it's facing in such a manner that it ensures privacy for the voters, meaning that it should be facing away from the open side of the room. Sometimes that's forgotten just as you're setting up, but you want to make sure you do that. For purposes of our training, though, we'll of course keep it facing this direction so that everyone can see what we're doing on the screen. The last thing that I'll point out about the OmniBallot is we want to make sure that voters get to vote independently. So we're going to provide assistance by helping them get the ballot loaded, but then we're going to leave it up to them to ask for additional assistance. That's the whole value in this equipment, is that if somebody is blind, the ballot can be read to them. If somebody has dexterity issues, they can either use the touch screen or they can use a tactile device that allows them to manipulate the screen and move through the prompts. But we allow them to make those choices for themselves, of course, providing assistance if we need to. But so let's actually talk about setup a little bit on this device. So again, we have instructions for the OmniBallot, and those instructions are in the soft case. And so we want to make sure that if you're being assigned to set this up, that you follow those instructions very closely to make sure that your setup is successful. It's really a very easy setup, but we just want you to make sure you're following those step-by-step instructions. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to actually unpack the OmniBallot and plug it in. The cords are going to live in your supply kits, and then it essentially just plugs into a power outlet or a surge protector, just like any other device. The plug-in is actually in the back of the gray case. We're also going to make sure that we connect and plug in the printer. The printer connects with a printer cable, and it has a power cord, so very easy setup. All of those connections are color-coded with dots, so you should be able to follow that if the instructions aren't clear enough for you. But we're going to make our power connections very early in the process, and then we're going to move on to the rest of the setup. The rest of the setup is going to include plugging in a QR code reader. That gets attached to the back of the QR code device. That allows the ballot to be scanned in so that it can pull up the right candidate listing and whatnot for that voter. That device stays active and available throughout the election day. Once we've made those simple connections, we get to actually power on the OmniBallot. That is one of the harder parts of the process. There's a little slot just to the right of the screen that has a power indicator. If you put your hand or finger inside of that, you'll actually feel a power button to turn on the OmniBallot. It'll pop up just like any other tablet or iPad that you might be using at home or at work. Once that pulls up, you'll get credentials from your election judge from your head judge, excuse me, in terms of what the login username and password is, and that will essentially open up the voting experience for the first voter who's going to use it. Very simple setup. Very simple as long as you follow those instructions. The other thing that we'll point out before we jump into the printer is that our OmniBallot cases actually get set up upside down based on the way that we have them set up for easier election morning processing for our judges. We want to make sure that we follow the stickers on there to have that device open up the right way. All of the contraptions, all of the accessories for the OmniBallot live in a carrying case underneath the screen, so it's all in one spot for you. So let's jump into the printer now just to give you a little bit more information on that. Sometimes the printer gives our election judges a little bit of grief. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we're plugged in, of course, and that we've got the data line connected to our tablet. If we've got that all good to go, we can actually make sure that the printer itself is powered on. Sometimes that falls asleep for our election judges, and so that gets them concerned that it's not working, but we can just make sure it's turned on. And then the last thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the bypass tray is ready for a ballot. The way that that actually looks when you're unpacking it is it's got a label that tells you to open, and then we pull out and flip out the bypass tray. What that does is that allows the ballot to be fully fed and have that ready for the voter once they've been issued a ballot. Again, the printer is pretty straightforward if we follow the instructions. So that's the moral of the story with the OmniBallot is follow the instructions and you should be able to set it up pretty effectively. All right, so now we've made it to the end of the night, right? It's 8 o'clock. Our last voter in the polling place at 8 o'clock has cast their ballot into the DS200 tabulator. Now we can start shutting this down. That is a very important rule. We do not start taking this down earlier than close of polls, even if no voters are using it, even if no voters are present. We have to have that available in case somebody shows up right at the end of the election day and wishes to vote using the Omni ballot. When you're ready to close it down, the head judge is going to make an assignment. This can be done by one person. Sometimes it's done by two people just because it's easier. But if you're assigned to close down the Omni ballot, you're going to enter the password that the head judge gives you, again, following the instructions that are provided with the Omni ballot. But we enter our administrator login credentials that allows us to close the polls. And essentially, that's our steps. We close the polls so that it can be boxed up and put away. When that's all done, you'll select shutdown on the screen, and that will allow you to actually close the tabulator to put it into no power mode, and then it comes back to our office so that we can get it ready for the next election. Again, very straightforward in terms of setting up and taking down the Omni ballot. Way easier to get that ready to roll, less onerous and less heavy than our old assisted voting devices. Before I leave the Omni ballot and we get into some of the troubleshooting tips on there, I do just want to make sure that we get the ballots loaded correctly. So remember, the voter receives a ballot just like every other voter in the polling place. Once they say that they want assistance on the Omni ballot, which is completely fine, the election judge who is working this station or working this area is going to help them by scanning the QR code that's in the back bottom corner of the ballot. And then that allows them to now put on the headphones, use the tactile device, or use the touch screen just to begin their voting process. At that point, they can follow the instructions and you as the election judge can step away. But before you step away, let's make sure that they've got their ballot loaded. Sometimes voters will want to do that themselves, but I'd encourage you to offer that assistance or even just do that after you've helped them scan it. The thing to remember with the ballot is that we always put it face down, top out, and the instructions tell us to do that. But face down, top out, that will fill in the ovals correctly based on the voter's intent. If you put the paper in the wrong way, or if the voter puts the paper in the wrong way, it's not a big deal. You can freeze the screen. A warning pops up or a prompt on the screen asks you if you have a completed ballot. That allows you to reprint that if necessary. You can just exchange the ballot and spoil out the old one if necessary. Some of the other questions that we oftentimes see with the Omni ballot, what's the admin code and password? That's a security protocol that your head judge will have, so they'll share that with you when you need to set up or tear down the equipment. Other than that, it's not kept near the pulpit, or excuse me, near the Omni ballot. We also already talked about how we select the right ballot. It's through the QR code scanning. So we would help the voter through that process, then allow them to vote as independently if they want. And then the last thing that we'll remind on the troubleshooting is that we want to make sure that we face this so the voter has privacy with the screen. The way I have this for the video is not good because everybody standing behind the voter can see what's going on. We want to make sure that when we set it up, we have that facing the wall so that that's not going to be visible to anybody but the voter on election day. All right, that's our Omni ballot. I will push that off to the side so that we can talk about our last piece of equipment. The last piece of equipment that we're going to be talking about is the poll pad. And the poll pad has been in use in Blue Earth County since 2018. We rolled it out to full countywide use in 2020, and our election judges love it. It helps them with election day registrations immensely, but it also helps speed up the check-in process. So it's a really good device, and hopefully as an election judge, you'll get some time to use it in the polling place. The poll pad is manufactured by Knowink. Knowink is a company based out of St. Louis, Missouri. These pieces of equipment were designed by an election administrator from Missouri, and he has now grown that company into nationwide use. These poll pads are used across the country, and they're used in many, many counties in the state of Minnesota, in addition to Blue Earth County. Ultimately, what the poll pad does is it verifies voters' check-in status, making sure that they're pre-registered. And if they're not pre-registered, it verifies that the voter is eligible to vote, that they're in the right location, and then helps the election judge through the election day registration process by asking the right questions, collecting the right information, and then verifying that voter out through a signature on an application before they're issued a ballot. A couple of things to remember right off the bat from the poll pad: if you're using them on election day, the screen is your screen. The only time a voter would ever see that screen is if they have a voucher, and in that fact, it's the voucher who sees the screen. Otherwise, you're the only person as the election judge who would be seeing the screen. We also want to make sure that you keep the poll pads plugged in throughout the election day. Of course, they have a battery, but we want to keep them powered and plugged in as much as possible. The other thing that I'll remind you about the poll pad is that it is specific to your precinct, so the screen is going to tell you what precinct it's assigned to, and we want to make sure that's the correct location that you're working on election day, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through the setup process. Okay. So let's talk about the setup process. One thing that we'll talk about before we set up the poll pad is that we want to make sure that we have the connectivity that's necessary in the polling place. This connectivity is a secure network connection, and what it does is it only provides updates for absentee voters from the central office to the poll pad or the precincts to make sure that somebody who maybe returned a ballot in person or mailed back a ballot that was received on election day isn't able to vote in the polling place as well on election day. We have some strong security measures that are going to make sure that that vote is only counted once, whether or not it's in person or by absentee, and that connectivity helps us do that. So as we set up that connectivity, you're going to follow the instructions that are provided. Most of our polling places have the Inseego antenna and wireless connection. That simply involves screwing on some antennas, plugging in the power, and then turning it on. We want to have that device near windows or where we've got good line of sight to satellites and antennas that would be outside. Keep it in the polling place, but we want to have it in a location that gives you the best connection. If you don't have this Inseego, you might be assigned a polling place that has the smaller MiFi or the Jetpack. The Jetpack works the exact same way. It's just a smaller device for smaller bandwidth. It gets plugged into power, and then you turn that on as well. The power button is on the side of the device. Most of our locations have the Inseego, so that's what we want to work with. And we want to get that set up very early on election morning to make sure that that's able to transmit data. Again, some folks have concerns with that transmitting of data, but that is a secure connection, and it's only passing back information that's supported in the polling place on paper records and also supported in the elections office in electronic systems. So we're able to share that information to update that absentee voting record to make sure that folks are voting only once. With that being said, let me switch over now to the actual poll pad and how we set that up. On election day, the polling place will have several poll pads, anywhere from 3 to maybe 10 or 12, depending on how big the polling place is and how busy the polling place is expected to be. They come in these green cases, and then you'll also have a supply kit that has extra rolls of receipt paper, screen cleaner, and whatnot. And so if you're assigned to set up the poll pads on election morning, you'll likely be doing that with one partner, one election judge. We don't have to worry about party balance in this instance. But what we want to do is have that one person or that one pair do all of the setup to make sure that we're not mixing anything up. But when we start setting up the poll pads, we're going to follow the instructions that actually live in the cases. Those instructions are going to be step by step, and they're going to walk you through the process that you'll need to follow setup. You can see that they're just on a strip of paper, and they'll give you pictures to set you up to make sure that everything is ready to roll for election day. All of our poll pads in Blue Earth County are assigned and paired up. So what that means is the number on the printer needs to match the number that you'll find on the back of the poll pad, and that will allow those two devices to communicate. So when you check in or do some sort of activity on the poll pad, it will print out appropriately on your receipt for the voter to sign. All right. We are going to make some pretty simple connections in order to get the poll pad set up once you've unpacked it from the case. Those setup connections are all color-coded, so you will know that you're doing it correctly by lining up red dots with red dots, green dots with green dots, but it is very, very simple to do. The printer has one power connection, and that's it. And then on the poll pad, we do a couple of additional connections. The first one would be bringing power, or not the first one, but one of the steps would be bringing power to the poll pad. Then we also want to make sure that we get the pull pad set up on the screen appropriately, or on the stand appropriately, and that's with some pink dots. You can see how that connects just on the back. It snaps into place, and then we have a place for ID cards to read, and that just slides into a plastic tray there. So again, the pull pad instructions tell you how to make all those connections, but once you've done it once, you can even do it without following those instructions, just by doing the color coded dots and lining those up appropriately. You'll be able to check your connections by some indicators on the screen. You'll see on the screen whether or not you have a printer connected. If you've got a green icon, you'll see that it's connected to other pull pads, and the count of pull pads it's connected to. And then we're going to make sure, like I mentioned, that it's in the right precinct, since those are precinct specific, and the home screen will tell you that as you work through it. Okay. The actual use of the pull pads on election day are something that we cover in our election judge rules and processes class, as well as in our election judge workshop. So if you're new to the pull pad, hopefully you've been able to attend one of those classes. Otherwise, you'll be able to learn more about it on election day. And if you're a returning judge, those screens, those prompts are very similar to what we used in 2020. So that device should be quite familiar to use once you get them set up in the polling place. All right, just like all of our other equipment now, we're moving on to end of night. So again, we're going to make sure that every voter who is in line at 8 p.m. is eligible to vote, has cast their ballot. But with the poll pads, we have the ability to start packing some of them up earlier. The golden rule with the poll pad is we have to keep at least one functional until 8 p.m. at night. If you're in a busy precinct and it's a busy election, you'll need more than one. Your head judge will help you with that. But we need to make sure we have at least one connected. As we start working through the poll pad teardown and packing those up, we want to give each poll pad some time to work through its data to make sure that it's providing its data updates and receiving data updates. So if you're ready to put this poll pad away, for example, we want to let it set for a couple of minutes to allow that final data transfer to occur. Then we can actually power it down and put it away. So a good way to think about that is if we're done with this poll pad, we're going to start putting away the printer, we're going to put away the power plug, the pen, the ID card holder. We'll get that all put away while we're letting that pad just kind of think and work through its end of night processing. Once we've given it a few minutes to do that, then we can power down the poll pad, and it really is as simple as that. And I can kind of show you how those steps work here by putting it away. That way you'll get a feel for the steps involved. Like I said, the printer is just one simple power plug, and so we can unplug that. And that cord is going to get rolled up and put inside of here. The printer just sits right inside the case. You'll have bands and everything that you need to wrap these up neatly, but for our purposes, we'll just kind of get it folded up in here. Okay, so we've got that put away while the poll pad is kind of passing its last data back and forth. We can take off our stylus and we can put away our ID card reader. There is a compartment for everything, so we can just put that in its hole. Pen lives in there as well. The power plugs get wrapped up, and that goes into a supply kit that you'll have. The base comes apart. That's how that was connected. It's just a simple pulling that apart. And then remember we mentioned that the back of this is connected with a clip, so that comes off the back. So that comes off. We're still letting the pull pad think its way through. We can put the stand inside the pull pad case, and we've now packed that up for us. That allows us to now power down the pull pad because it has had enough time to send its last data back, and we can power that off. Okay. Again, you can do that as you're getting closer to 8 o'clock, as long as we keep one live. We want to make sure we're doing that. And then the other thing that we want to do is we want to make sure we don't power down the last poll pad until the head judge tells you to do so, because he or she is going to need to pull some counts off of those poll pads and make sure that they're recording a number of check-ins and whatnot. So they'll actually help you determine when you can start shutting down your poll pads. We're just showing you what that process looks like. When you have that done, you can close up the cases. They are ready to roll. And they'll be either returned to the elections office or picked up by election staff. And then we'll be set to go with that. We want to make sure that as we've got all the poll pads put away, that sometimes our judges forget about their hotspot or that wireless connection. So make sure once you're all done with all the poll pads, you go and pack that up and return that as well. Okay. Lots of steps there. When you get to experience them in the polling place or at our workshop, you'll see how user-friendly they are, how easy they are to set up, and then also use on election day. Let's leave you with just some tips for the poll pad use. These will be good resources for you on election day. I'll focus on a couple of them, make sure that you're familiar with them now. But I'll also point out that all of these tips are either available in a cheat sheet in the poll pad, they're in our election judge position binder, so they'll talk you through the steps involved with that. And then we have other resources as well that will be available. Let's talk about just a couple of the tips that are the most important. Number one is the most important by far. Make sure that you're following all the instructions on the screen. They're going to make sure that you're checking in voters correctly, that there's no statuses that we need to worry about, that you're registering the voters according to state law. So we want to follow that. Another one that's important is number two. We want you to use address suggestions as you're adding a voter's address. If you slowly type the street name after putting in the house number, it will give you the correct option and then automatically fill in the rest of the data for you. Another thing that I want to keep you in mind is that we want to use the precinct finder on the poll pad. Remember, these are specific to your location. So if you can't find an address for a voter, that means they're likely in the wrong location. So we want you to be familiar with that and use that. The last tip on here that I'll pull out for your attention is that the poll pads do scan driver's licenses, but using a driver's license is not a requirement in the state of Minnesota. So if a voter provides you with the driver's license, we want to make sure that you inform the voter that it's not required so that everybody else around also hears that, but you can still use that to scan and check in the voter based on their name or use that as part of the election day registration process. It's a really slick feature, but we just need to make sure that voters know that that's not a requirement. The other tips on this slide that are in your handouts are also very helpful, and you can kind of read those and review those as you have some additional time. So let's talk about some troubleshooting on the poll pad. We get phone calls on once in a while about it, the printer not printing. That's almost always due to the printer not being plugged in and turned on, so make sure that's set. If that's not the case, you might have misconnected and have the wrong poll pad and printer combinations, so check that. We also do get questions on occasion about the hotspot and whether or not that's working. Make sure that's plugged into power, and then you might need to locate that in a different spot near a window in the building if you're having access issues there. Usually that's a phone call to our office to try to remedy. And then we can also talk about how you can make sure that the poll pad is plugged in and charging. It's just like any other Apple device. It'll indicate in the corner what the battery status is, so you want to watch that to make sure that it's always charging. All right. Thanks so much for watching this video. Hopefully this helped you understand a little bit about how the equipment is set up. Remember, this wasn't designed to be a replacement to the workshop, so if you're a new judge, hopefully you were able to attend that. Otherwise, we of course have resources for you. The slides are available as part of the training website at becvotes.org. We also have all of the cheat sheets, all of the setups as part of the equipment packages. Your head judge has instructions. The responsibility or the position binders for our election judges have additional tips and tricks and instructions. So you're not left alone with the equipment. We just wanted to talk you through some of it so that you had a video to review prior to the election day. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to call our office and we can walk you through anything that you might not understand or wasn't clear in this video. And other than that, we look forward to seeing you at training, and thank you very much for your service as election judges.